Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm joined on this panel by three distinguished Croatians, two historians, Dr. Mario Zagreb and Dr. Nikica Baric, and journalist, commentator, and film director and writer Višnja Starešina. Mario and Nikica are both historians from the Hrvatski Institute za povijest, the Croatian Historical Institute. I owe both of them a profound personal debt because without them I wouldn't have been able to draft the history that I have written about modern Croatia. You get to know academics only when you need help from them, really. There are academics who don't really know anything at all. They appear on Croatian television, usually. Those who do know a lot are more reluctant to do so. There are also academics who do know something, but are not very generous. But in the case of Dr. Zagreb and Dr. Baric, they know an enormous amount. These are superb historians, and they are immensely generous, which is quite rare. I mean, generous with their information, with their advice, and so on. And the Croatian Historical Institute is really something that is of great importance in the life of Croatia and not fully, I think, appreciated. Because the quality, the objectivity, the rigor, and the productivity of Hrvatski Institute za povijest is phenomenal. Now, Višnja is a journalist, commentator, immensely experienced, very wise, with a great knowledge both of local and regional and international matters, but also a skilled film writer and director. And just in the same way as Mario and Nikica stick to the truth rather than sensationalism or exaggeration, she, an even greater rarity in this area, sticks to the truth without exaggeration. And on some of these matters, exaggeration, should we say, on the right side, if one could put it like that, has done an immense amount of harm. Because false facts, half facts, are then used by those who do not want to hear the facts at all. But her films about Vukovar, about the communist crimes, and indeed one of my own specialities, Stepinac, are 100% and first rate. And it's very good that we've heard from our Slovene guest, Dr. Dežman, about these past communist crimes, often committed against Croats, and current attempts to conceal or minimize them. And it was during the Slovenian presidency of the Council of the European Union in 2008, we should recall, that the only serious analysis of the crimes committed by totalitarian regimes in Europe was made. In Slovenia, I think, though political conditions are harder, they fight more openly and effectively for the truth to come out about communism than we do here, unfortunately. And we should try and remedy that a little today. And as you've seen, we have been doing so. Well, Mario will, I believe, talk mainly about the immediate post-war period. Nikica will be concentrating on later communist repression, I believe. Višnja will be discussing living with the legacy of lies. And our panel tomorrow on the crimes of communism and its legacy will address these themes relating to Eastern and Central Europe as a whole, whereas we now are mainly going to focus on Yugoslavia. Actually, I'm going to focus on some other things as well, because I want to talk initially about communism and its unchanging objectives. I want to discuss the manipulation of language, and I want to talk rather more about Josip Broz Tito, the myth and the reality. And finally, I shall touch a little, is that better? Of course not. I shall touch on the imposition of communism. Well, one of the worst mistakes in life is to underestimate your enemy. And it's even more dangerous to do that than to overestimate your friend, if you're lucky enough to have one. Well, the West, even at the height of the Cold War, underestimated communism. Now, this applies far less to the West's Cold War heroes like Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, but it's true all the same of all of us. And there's a paradox here, you know, because we overrated, we swallowed more propaganda than we should have done, the size of the Soviet economy and the size of its still formidable arsenal of weapons. We did this partly because leftists, often, as we now know, agents of influence of the party, went far in the West in suggesting that eventually a compromise must be made with the communist system, a kind of halfway house of what was sometimes called democratic socialism. We knew what were termed the captive nations of Eastern Europe. They were described like that in the annually confirmed 1959 Act of the US Congress. We knew that those nations were indeed held captive. But Western anti-communists underrated something that Plato, at least, would not have done. We underrated, I think, the desire of so many elements of that communist system to remain captive, to remain on top, or at least to remain in relative comfort without doing anything very much to earn the comfort. The initial impulse for people to sign up to the party is described in a once famous but now largely forgotten classic, Witness, the memoirs of Whittaker Chambers, published in 1952. Chambers, you may recall, broke with the American Communist Party and testified against communist spies, notably the internationally venerated spy Alger Hiss. For this temerity, Chambers suffered abuse from the liberal establishment, and not just from the party fellow travellers either, which can properly, I think, be described as a non-bloody martyrdom. Viewing what the party's zealots offered, Whittaker Chambers describes communism, I quote, as the great alternative faith of mankind. Like all great faiths, its force derives from a simple vision. The communist vision is the vision of man without God. It is the central experience, says Chambers, of the first half of the 20th century. Now, I think this point is crucial, because although power lust, spite, revenge, greed, a propensity to steal the property of others, and if you can't steal it, destroy it, these things were important, they were really not the central features of communist revolution. In this region, those base instincts were heavily mixed up, as we know, with national rivalries and hatreds, a further factor. Finally, once established, the system was upheld, along with terror, by that real but intangible comfort offered by an all-embracing party structure described by Alexander Zinoviev in The Reality of Communism. Well, despite all that, it's the ideology which is central. In other words, it is communism itself. We historians are inclined to ask why some massacre was committed by the Yugoslav partisans, that is, by the communists. And we fall back on some explanation, which may or may not have much to be said for it. But the preceding question is, why should communists not behave like this when they had the chance? We ask, and Maria will be talking about this, why did the partisans kill so many Catholic priests? But again, if you're a communist, why not do so? Since the publication of the controversial but never successfully challenged Black Book of Communism in 1997, there has been no more serious attempt to deny the horrendous cost in human life of the revolutions, wars, politically induced or exploited disasters and persecution that the communists inflicted. The old guard communists would not in any case have denied or apologized for the bloodshed. Blood marked the path to justice and equality as they understood them. Vladimir Nazor, the famous Croatian poet, a non-party member but a reliable party stooge, reveals this mentality in a speech on the formation of the partisan government of Croatia in the spring of 1945. And he said, "I have heard that some people don't consider us the most competent to do what we do, because we aren't properly elected in the old manner by the people. Truthfully," says Nazor, "we can have a good laugh when we hear such things being said. We were chosen and we won votes by other means. The electoral votes for us are those drops, those billions of drops of blood from the veins of our youngsters. We won a plebiscite in a way that no side ever won it before." End of quote. Well, violence is for Marxist-Leninists the quickest and preferred route to justice. But justice is not, of course, the result. The Russian dissident Vladimir Bukovsky remarked once about Lenin's statement that you cannot make an omelette without breaking eggs, that he'd seen plenty of broken eggs but never tasted any omelette. Less flippantly, the figures for deaths inflicted by communists are staggering. More than 90 million worldwide, about 1 million of these in Eastern Europe, and that figure excludes the 20 million in the Soviet Union. Marxism-Leninism's bitterest enemy was and is religion. Marx had described religion as the opium of the people. Lenin, though, considered this much too kind. He wrote that religion was really, I quote, "a kind of spiritual rot-gut by which the slaves of capital blacken their human figure." End of quote. Speaking to Gorky, Lenin went further. He said, "Every religious idea, every idea of God, even flirting with the idea of God, is unutterable vileness." Well, under Stalin, an accommodation was reached with the Russian Orthodox Church, which ended the persecution, but also ensured complete party control. The warmongering for Putin by Moscow Patriarch Kirill, otherwise known in the Kremlin by his agent's code name Mikhailov, as revealed by the Romanian defector and spy chief General Ion Patsepa, testifies to the enduring effects of that infiltration. Accommodations involving various degrees of infiltration and subordination were reached with other Orthodox churches, including the Serbian Orthodox Church. Well, this leads to a further general point: the nature of communist totalitarianism. Totalitarianism, one must repeat this ad nauseam, is not the same as authoritarianism, and nor, despite overuse of the term here in Croatia, is it the same as dictatorship. Dictatorship relates to who, usually but not always one individual, wields absolute power, but what that absolute power involves is a different matter. Authoritarianism, I would say, is always preferable to revolutionary government or anarchy. Many quite successful governments have been authoritarian, as in Chile under Pinochet or Spain under Franco. They have also been quite popular. Authoritarian governments limit their intervention to the public sphere, so that politics is banned, but private life carries on. In wars, of course, all governments are to varying degrees authoritarian. A totalitarian regime, however, is the imposition of what Edmund Burke termed, speaking of the French Revolution, an armed doctrine. The objectives of totalitarians are, as the word suggests, total control of every aspect of society, including private life. Totalitarianism is a revolution that has come to power. There are differences between totalitarian regimes. National Socialism, as we know, aimed at the elimination of the Jews and other races it considered subhuman or dangerous, and the promotion of a particular idea of a good German. Communism, though, is more ambitious. It adapts to and exploits national identity, but with the ultimate aim of destroying nationhood, just as it seeks to destroy faith. Communism seeks to create an entirely new kind of human being. Human nature repeatedly gets in the way, but anything else that imposes itself is subverted or crushed. These broader considerations are all relevant to what the communists did in Yugoslavia and its constituent republics, including Croatia. This reality is less easy to perceive, however, because of two other factors that I must mention, both of them of relevance to us today. And the first of these factors is what is usually called the Yugoslav national question. The late Professor Ivo Banac, in his great book, The National Question in Yugoslavia, published in 1984, showed how the unresolved question of nationhood alone made sense of events in the first Yugoslavia. It also shaped the second Yugoslavia, and the Communist Party's entirely predictable failure to solve it brought that state crashing down in the wars of Yugoslav succession, including Croatia's own war of independence, or Homeland War. Now, for those who are unfamiliar with the history, and some of you will certainly be unfamiliar with it, let me, in no more than a nutshell, explain the essentials. Those who know it all must just be as patient as I am. Which is not usually very patient, but anyway, you must be patient. Croatia had, in 1918, joined the kingdom of the Serbs, Croats and Slovenes. The name formally changed to Yugoslavia in 1929, which was ruled by the Serb Karađorđević dynasty. That state, contrary to Croatians' unrealistic hopes, was a unitary state in which the Serbian court, Serbian officer corps, and Serbian Orthodox Church were dominant. A devolved government for Croatia, the Croatian Banovina, was established in 1939 after negotiations between the Croatian Peasants' Party leader Vlatko Maček and the regent Prince Paul. It lasted until 1949, when Yugoslavia, under pressure from Hitler, joined the Tripartite Pact. This prompted a British-inspired coup by the Serb military, and that in turn prompted a rapidly successful invasion by the Axis powers. Between April 1941 and May 1945, a puppet Ustasha, fascist-style, government under the Poglavnik leader Ante Pavelić ruled an independent state of Croatia, Nezavisna država Hrvatska, or NDH. Italy, in fact, annexed much of the coast and shared uneasily with the Third Reich military control over other areas. As elsewhere in Nazi-occupied countries, including Serbia, a Holocaust was practiced against the Jews. Persecution was also practiced by the Croatian Ustasha regime against the Serbs, which prompted a mass uprising. A large but disputed number of Jews, Serbs and others died in NDH concentration camps, notably Jasenovac. Meanwhile, the opposition to the Third Reich and the NDH bifurcated into a nationalist Serb movement, the Chetniks, under Colonel Draža Mihailović, and the communists or partisans under Tito. The Chetniks committed numerous atrocities against Croats and Muslims in pursuit of an ethnically pure Greater Serbia. The atrocities of the partisans we'll discuss in a minute. Churchill, exasperated by the failure of the Chetniks to fight Germans, shifted support to Tito. Eventually, having been armed and then saved by Britain, Tito flew off to Stalin in Moscow, and enjoying Soviet backing, his forces entered Belgrade in 1944, riding on Russian tanks. Later, in circumstances which I cannot really touch on because of lack of time, Tito formed the first communist government of Yugoslavia, which he ruled until his death in 1980, and which staggered on until 1990. Well, alongside the intrusion of arguments about which nation did more harm to the other, arguments which today help push the crimes of communism into the background, we truth seekers also face the problem of the manipulation and misuse of language, which is the second factor to which I turn. The partisan victory in 1945 was, and still often is, described as the liberation. It was, of course, no such thing, as became quickly apparent. It was a shift from one kind of repression to another. Where the fascist Ustasha regime had been chaotic, the communist regime was orderly, but both were totalitarian and both were bloody. The themes of liberty and anti-fascism were blared out by the party to conceal the reality of its power and the nature of its objectives, mainly for foreign, especially British, consumption. Tito thus described himself as supreme commander of the Yugoslav people's liberation struggle. The word partisan, incidentally, which sounds so much better, doesn't it, than communist or rebel, was devised on a Russian model. Anti-fascism has a more complicated background. The term anti-fascist in Italian-occupied Istria from the 1920s and later in Italian-occupied Dalmatia meant essentially anti-Italian. Anti-Italian. Italy having, of course, been ruled by the fascists from 1922. The fascist ideology of the occupiers polarized opinion among the resistance, but that resistance was essentially national, Croat and Slovene in Istria, Croat in Dalmatia. The use of the term anti-fascist more generally is a communist device. It reflects the party's decision in 1936 to move to a popular front strategy to resist Hitler. This involved uniting all centrist and leftist forces under a moderate banner till times changed, as they soon did, because in 1939 the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact ended Popular Front anti-fascism overnight. Far from supporting resistance to fascism, or in practice Nazism, Tito in 1940 praised the party's, in other words Stalin's, decision to stay out of what he called the Second Imperialistic War, and boasted of the party's, as he put it, tireless struggle against various agents of the imperialistic powers, England and France, which tried with all their might to push Yugoslavia into the war on their side. End of quote of Tito. Yet fascism was not dead, it merely slept, until on the 22nd of June 1941, Hitler disobligingly launched Operation Barbarossa against the Soviet Union. Now Tito and the Yugoslav party transformed themselves into resistance heroes. Anti-fascism thereafter remained a somewhat threadbare concept. Anti-fascist organizations were just party-controlled organizations. Surprisingly, nowadays in Croatia, and even more remarkably in the West, anti-fascism is again in vogue. Anyone wanting today to analyze communist crimes has therefore to clear away a lot of this propagandist detritus which has been carefully piled up to prevent the truth emerging. And if you want to seek the truth, you're quite likely to be accused of being a revisionist. Now, the term revisionism was devised by Stalinists to condemn their opponents of ideological heresy in questioning whether what the party leadership was pursuing was really authentic Marxism-Leninism. And all these opponents were called factionalists, unless and until, of course, the faction itself took control. The accusation of revisionism belies a totalitarian mindset in the accuser and suggests, if he or she is an historian, a high degree of stupidity. After all, unless one is performing something very rare, namely investigating facts that no historian has ever investigated before, one is certainly going to be a revisionist. Otherwise, what's the point of writing? The accusation of revisionism now comes from the left, who do not want the crimes of communism discussed, only the crimes of fascism and Nazism. But over time, the party's propaganda has gone very deep. So not just philo-communists are outraged. For example, almost all the propaganda used now by the Serbian state and the Serbian Orthodox Church to blacken Croats as genocidal monsters and to discredit Croatian state policy was originally devised by the communists. The very same words and phrases are used to support the same lies, for example, by Mr. Dacic. And so, talking of liars, we come to Tito. Tito must be understood. This is not made easier because there is no adequate, supposed to lengthy and adulatory, biography of him, and the documentation in Belgrade is still largely unexplored. The most important point about him is, very simply, that he was a communist. Yes, he had a taste for villas, and he finished up with over 20. He had a taste for fancy cars. He had a huge fleet of them. He liked fat cigars, he liked yachts, and he liked all kinds of material vulgarity. But he was and remained a hard-line orthodox Marxist-Leninist. He had luck and cunning, and he deviated tactically to survive, but not with sincerity, and his methods remained those of Stalin. Blessed Cardinal Archbishop Aloysius Stepinac, imprisoned and probably murdered at Tito's orders, described communism as mendacium incarnatum, the lie incarnate. Now this also describes Tito. Nothing, really nothing, that the Marshal said for public, or indeed for much private consumption, can be taken at face value. Tito was born to a Croat father and a Slovene mother on the 7th of May 1892, though the date was falsified and his official birthday was later celebrated on 25th of May. He served in the Austro-Hungarian army in the First World War and was decorated for bravery when fighting, please note, against the Serbs, please note, in Serbia. This embarrassing fact was concealed. Tito was always on the ideological left of the party. He was indeed a committed revolutionary. In the 1930s, the leader of the Yugoslav party, Milan Gorkic, was summoned to Moscow and was killed in Stalin's purges, along with more than 700 leading Yugoslav communists. Tito was ambitious. He wanted the leadership. He took the risk of going to Moscow. There he benefited from the protection of the NKVD. Like others, he sought favour by denouncing his fellow communists. Unusually among these victims were Tito's 2 former wives. One had already been shot, in fact, but the other was imprisoned and remained there until after Stalin's death. On his return to Yugoslavia, Tito quickly took control of the party with Moscow's approval. We should dwell for a moment on the contrast between Tito's international reputation and the reality of his behaviour. Tito was thought to be a covert friend of the West, a factor for stability and so on. And one result of this was that since Yugoslavia was not thought of as being a real communist country, no one later insisted on lustration or punishment for atrocities. On his death, world leaders assembled to give Tito a high-powered send-off. The occasion was used in what, I must say, I find perhaps tastelessly, an extraordinarily funny propaganda film. The incessant weeping of his widow Jovanka, she would later have much more to weep about, incidentally, is punctuated by contrived shots of world leaders staggering around in tears. Now, I knew Margaret Thatcher. Margaret Thatcher rarely cried. She did so when she left office. Perhaps she did so when she peeled the onions. But here her shoulders are heaving with unquenchable and photographically manipulated lachrymosity. In Croatia, as elsewhere in Yugoslavia, the propaganda reached imbecilic heights. The leader of the Croatian communists, the talentless Milka Planinc, to whom the city of Zagreb now wants to dedicate a street, declared counterfactually, "Tito has not died. Tito cannot die." Or as the official slogan had it, after Tito, Tito! Tito was not a friend of the West. He was not a moderate. He was not seeking a halfway house through self-management, samoupravljanja, between socialism and capitalism. He was a communist opportunist who reverted to type and who lied about it whenever pressed. He not only knew about, but, as Milovan Djilas says, must have authorized the liquidation of thousands of NDH troops and civilians handed over by the British at Bleiburg in May 1945, and the subsequent death marches, the remains of which we have seen, the so-called Way of the Cross, the Križni Put. Naturally, he lied about it. He told the Vatican diplomat, Monsignor Nicola Moscatello, that the Croats had killed the Bleiburg victims to keep it in the family. Later, however, he told the Croatian sculptor Ivan Meštrović that the Serbs had done it, and, as he put it, nothing could be done. But Tito and Ranković ordered it, and Osna, the secret police, and Knoj, their militia, and other partisan units did it. When Tito broke with Stalin, though one should more exactly say when Stalin broke with Tito, in 1948, it was because Tito disobeyed Stalin's instructions to stop communist expansion in Greece and Albania. Stalin thought this risked a Third World War. Yugoslavia was then forced into the hands of the Americans, but Tito did not moderate his behavior. He radicalized it to prove his Marxist-Leninist credentials. Only now did the catastrophic attempts at agricultural collectivization begin. A still tighter control was exercised on higher education, and now began the most serious attempts to create a communist front Croatian Catholic Church. The harshest Stalinist techniques of terror in the name of re-education were practiced on the prison island of Goli Otok against the regime's opponents. The economic and gradual political liberalization, which eventually occurred from the 1960s, was the result of Western pressure and the economic failure of the socialist system. It did not reflect goodwill or enlightenment by the party or the marshal. The communist revolution in Yugoslavia involved mass killing and imprisonment. It also involved the confiscation of property. Those Jews who had survived the Holocaust or their relatives found it difficult and often hazardous to seek return of what they'd lost. Totalitarianism, to return to my initial theme, requires the elimination or subversion of every obstacle to the system. I'm just going to give you one specific example, that of Dubrovnik in 1944. Many of those arrested in the wider Dubrovnik area when the partisans arrived that October were taken to Korčula, imprisoned, interrogated, and then 124 of them killed. Those seized by Osna in Dubrovnik itself were liquidated on the little island of Daksa on the nights of 25th and 26th of October. The victims were guilty, as far as we know, of nothing. Their choice, therefore, revealed the party's intentions and priorities. 45 people were killed. They included 8 priests, 7 Catholic and 1 Orthodox. Along with the priests were 3 lawyers, 2 journalists and 4 professors. The authorities did not bother with interrogation, let alone a trial, though one was later invented. The victims were gathered in the city's Carmen prison and then taken by lorry and boat to their fate. The point had been made. The elite was decimated and terrorized, though Dubrovnik remained politically suspect. The middle class and the educated elite of Zagreb were intimidated and reduced to penury. Thousands of displaced or just opportunistic partisan families flooded into the capital and took up residence in the city's best housing, along with their chickens and other livestock. Zagreb was thoroughly Balkanized, a Yugoslav and communist shared aim. The Croatian Peasants' Party, which would certainly have won any free elections, was denied the opportunity. It was infiltrated and split and reduced to impotence. The most powerful opponent that the Communist Party in Yugoslavia faced was the Catholic Church, led during this crucial period by the indomitable Archbishop Stepinac and Maria Jeleb. I know we'll talk about this. I'd just like to stress 2 facts. First, the Catholic Church in Yugoslavia was subject to a murderous pogrom comparable only with that practiced against the Catholic Church by the left in Spain. There is no other equivalent. Secondly, because the communist authorities were never able to gain control of the church, the faith re-emerged to take the place of communism as the public expression of Croatian nationhood. Despite that, if you look around Croatia today, or indeed Zagreb today, you will find plenty of memorials to partisan triumphs, but almost none to the victims of communism. Unlike in Slovenia, the mass graves in Croatia, which keep on turning up as some new gruesome discoveries made during building work, are not systematically explored. The remains of the victims are not honoured. no one in public life bothers to mention them. The official amnesia in Croatia about the crimes of communism is revealing, it is one-sided, it is dishonest, and its implications, to say the least, are disturbing. Thank you.